The Black Pearl jolted, a raw, grinding roar tore through the ship, ripping me from a blurry stupor. Alarms screeched, red lights flashing like a pulse in the dark cockpit. I scrambled up, the stale reek of old coffee and desperation hitting me hard. My name's Rick, just a cargo grunt schlepping fertilizer, and jumped to nowhere colonies. No glamour here. But this wasn't normal, not by a long shot. My hand snatched the blaster off the console, fingers shaky with a rush burning my veins. Space was supposed to be dead quiet, an empty void. Not now. Not with this chaos breaking the silence. The cargo bay hatch hissed, splitting open as I froze, blaster raised. Sweat prickled my neck, the void gaping back, black and endless. Then a faint glow pierced it. Not a crate or a busted pipe. A baby hovered an inch off the deck, alive, breathing, defying gravity like it was nothing. His eyes slammed into me. Huge, round, glowing blue like stars trapped in a tiny skull. They sliced the shadows with a calm that twisted my gut, unsettling and strange. A crumpled note drifted down beside him. Take care of him until I return. No name, no hint, just a command that felt like a trap closing around me. What the hell? I growled, edging closer, boots thudding loud against the deck. The kid didn't cry or flinch, just stared, those glowing eyes pinning me with heat. I waited for the universe to blink, to laugh and call a glitch. Nothing came, just the hum of life support and that stare pulling me in. You know this is crazy, right? I said to him, half expecting an answer. No reply came, just that light tugging at me like a dare I couldn't refuse. I yanked my scanner off my belt, running it over his tiny form. Human, or close enough. Healthy, no toxins, the readings said. But normal stopped there. His hair floated like he was underwater, soft and wild. He levitated, defying everything I knew about space and physics. The scanner sparked, flickered, then flatlined with a weak chirp. Fantastic, I snarled, chucking it aside in frustration. Not just a kid, a powered kid, I muttered to myself. Exactly what a guy like me needs, I added, sarcasm dripping thick. I scrubbed my face, stubble scraping my hand, grounding me. I wasn't built for this. Rick, the lone hauler, not some babysitter in the stars. The Black Pearl was a junker, not a cradle for some glowing mystery. But those eyes hit me low, a slow burn that wasn't fear or hunger. It was more like a tease, something I couldn't name or shake. I couldn't ditch him, couldn't flush him out the airlock like bad cargo. The note mocked me. Take care of him, it demanded silently. Who'd do this? Who'd leave him with me, of all people? Why me? Out of every grunt in the galaxy. Rule 1 of space, I said, snagging a cup of recycled coffee. The bitter kick steadied me, a lifeline in the madness. When you're screwed, think it through with a drink, I muttered. I glanced at him, still floating, still staring with that eerie glow. You don't get this, but I need it, I told him, half laughing. I scooped him up, clumsy as hell, his little frame warm against my chest. His glow flared, a pulse sinking into me, stirring something deep and restless. It felt like the void whispered secrets through his skin, raw and alive. I set him on a crate, wrapping him in a thermal blanket quickly. He stayed quiet, watching me, hair drifting as if underwater. Tiny hands flexed like he was feeling the air around him. What am I doing with you, huh? I muttered, leaning in close. His eyes locked mine, that glow, damn, it wasn't just pretty. It was a spark, hot and alive, tugging at me like a forgotten touch. My mind flashed to Lithos 9, a smoky bar, a woman named Zara. Zanari warrior, all strength and curves. Her blue eyes cut through me that night. Her body pressed to mine in a clash of heat and liquor, wild and fleeting. One night, then she was gone. Could this be hers, ours? The baby, Max, I called him, needing a name, floated higher. A soft hum vibrated from him, filling the air with energy. My coffee cup lifted, spinning slow in the air before me. Oh, come on, I said, grabbing it back with a scowl. He giggled, a sound that flickered the ship's lights for a heartbeat. Great, powers and a comedian, I grumbled, shaking my head. You're trouble, Max. I added, half amused, half wary. I slumped onto a crate, him hovering beside me, blue glow washing the bay. Trouble was an understatement. I like my life simple, quiet runs and empty space. Now, I had a levitating kid with eyes that burned into me, teasing something unnamed. His hand brushed my finger, jolt shooting through, warm, electric. It felt like a promise I hadn't signed up for, pulling me deeper. "All right, Max," I said, voice low, resigned but steady. "You're with me now. Let's figure this out," I told him. The ship droned on, the void stretching wide around us. It wasn't lonely anymore. Max's light pushed back the dark. Those eyes weren't just watching. They pulled me in, hinting at heat. Whoever left him picked me for a reason, I realized. That scared me more than his tricks, because I was already caught. Hey, space renegades. Hooked yet? Rick's a lone hauler, but now he's tangled with Max. A glowing, floating mystery with a past that's about to ignite. Want more cosmic heat? Smash that like if Max's powers got you buzzing, and subscribe to catch the next drop. Things get steamy when Zara, a warrior goddess, crashes back into Rick's life. Hit the bell for more spicy space sagas full of danger, desire, and wild twists. Comment below, would you keep Max? Buckle up, part 2's coming hot. Rick leaned back in the pilot's chair of the Black Pearl, the hum of the engines a steady drone beneath his chaos. The cargo bay was quiet now, or as quiet as it could be with Max around. The kid hovered a few inches above a crate, his glowing blue eyes fixed on Rick. They stared like he was the most fascinating thing in the galaxy, unnerving and bright. A week had passed since that damn note turned Rick's world upside down. He was still no closer to answers, the questions gnawing at him. Who left Max here? And why pick him of all people? The coffee in his hand was cold, but he sipped it anyway. The bitter taste was a lifeline, keeping his sanity from slipping away. "All right, rule 2 of space," Rick muttered, setting the cup down on the console. "When a universe hands you a floating kid, figure out how to not die," he said. He glanced at Max, whose tiny hands flexed with a faint glow. A wrench drifted lazily across the bay, caught in his power. Rick snatched at midair, grumbling, "You're gonna break something, kid. And it better not be me," he added, half serious, half exasperated. Max giggled, a high, bright sound that flickered the ship's lights briefly. Rick sighed, rubbing his temples with a tired hand. The kid's powers were a nightmare, unpredictable and wild. Bottles floated away if Rick didn't hand them over fast enough, spilling milk in starry bubbles. Last night, Max had cried, loud and sharp, piercing the silence. Rick woke up plastered to the ceiling, his shirt tangled around his arms. He'd cursed the day he'd ever set foot in space, frustration boiling over. "You're a menace," he told Max, who just stared back, glowing and smug. But the real kicker wasn't the chaos. It was the pull he felt. Every time Max's eyes locked on him, Rick sensed it, a low, restless heat. It was like the kid tugged at something buried deep inside him. It wasn't fatherly instinct, not yet, just raw, stranger, a spark he couldn't name. He shook it off, grabbing a protein bar from the stash nearby. "Stay put," he said, tossing a spare blanket over Max's small form. The kid giggled again, the blanket lifting an inch before Rick pinned it down. "No funny business," he warned, his voice firm but softening. The ship jolted. A soft thud against the hull broke the moment. Rick's hand flew to his blaster, heart kicking up with a jolt. "What now?" he muttered, checking the scanners quickly. Nothing showed. No ships, no debris, just the endless black. But the air felt heavy, charged, like something was watching him. He stood, pacing the cockpit, restless and on edge. A flicker caught his eye, a shadow moving in the corner, gone when he turned. "Great. Now I'm seeing things," he grumbled to himself. His mind drifted, unbidden, to Lithos 9, to her Zura. The memory hit hard, sharp as a blade, through his chest. That smoky bar, her silhouette cutting through the haze like a vision. She'd walked in like she owned the place, a Zenari warrior in gleaming armor. It hugged her like a lover, tight over thighs that could snap a man in half. Her hips flared, swaying with every step a hypnotic rhythm. Her chest stretched the armor full, stealing the air from the room. Her eyes, blue as Max's but deeper, darker, pinned him from across the bar. That look stripped him bare, without a word, raw and piercing. She'd slid into the seat beside him, her scent, spice and steel, flooding his senses. Her voice was low and husky as she'd said, "You look like trouble." "Me?" He'd shot back, smirking despite the heat rising in him. "You're the one with blood on your boots," he'd countered playfully. She'd laughed, a sound that curled around him like smoke, intoxicating. She leaned closer, her shoulder brushing his, her thigh pressing his leg onto the table. The heat of her skin seeped through her armor, a slow burn igniting his pulse. One drink turned to three, the night blurring in emotion. Then they were stumbling to a back room, her hands rough and sure. They'd yanked his jacket off, her lips crashing into his with hunger. It left him dizzy, lost in the fire of her touch. Her fingers traced his chest, sliding down to his waist, teasing him. They stopped just short of driving him wild, a deliberate edge. Her breath was hot against his ear as she'd whispered, "One night, cargo man. Don't get attached," she'd added, her voice a velvet warning. Rick blinked, the memory fading, his breath uneven and ragged. He glanced at Max, still floating, oblivious to the storm in Rick's mind. "Your mom." "Huh," he muttered, voice thick with realization. "She'd do this, dump you on me and vanish," he said, half to himself. But the thought lingered, her touch, her heat, the way she'd owned him. Could Max be hers? Could he be theirs a piece of that night? The idea sent a shiver through him. Not just fear, something hotter, deeper. The lights flickered again, harder this time, snapping him back. A soft hum filled the air. Not Max this time, something else. Rick spun, blaster up, as the cockpit screen flared to life. Static crackled, then cleared, revealing her, Zara, or a ghost of her. A hologram shimmered in blue, her form as real as that night. She stood tall, armor gleaming, tendrils of dark hair framing her face. Her eyes pierced through the projection, locking onto him. "Rick," she said, voice low, a velvet edge hitting him like a punch. He froze, coffee cup slipping from his hand, floating away. "Zara," he rasped, throat dry, eyes tracing her, those thighs, that waist. Her chest rose with a breath he couldn't hear, vivid and haunting. "What the hell?" he started, but she cut in, sharp but smooth. "No time," she said, her gaze locking his with urgency. "He's mine, ours," she declared, words heavy with meaning. "Keep him safe, they're coming," she warned, voice unwavering. The hologram flickered, her hand reaching out, fingers brushing the air. It almost touched him, and Rick swore he felt it, a ghost of heat. It slid from his shoulder to his chest, stopping his breath cold. "Who's coming?" he demanded, stepping closer, desperate. "Zara, damn it, talk to me," he shouted, but she faded. The screen went dark, leaving him staring at nothing but void. His heart hammered, her scent lingering in his mind, spice, steal her. He turned to Max, who giggled, a bottle drifting past Rick's face. It brushed his cheek like a tease, light and playful. "Perfect timing, kid," Rick growled, snagging it from the air. He handed it to Max, who grabbed it with tiny, glowing hands. His glow pulsed brighter, a steady hum of energy. Rick sank into the chair, rubbing his face with both hands. "Your mom's gonna kill me, or drive me crazy first," he muttered. That hologram, her voice, her eyes, had lit a fire in him. It was a restless ache he couldn't shake, burning deep. She'd always been trouble, a storm he couldn't escape. But now she was a phantom haunting his ship, her presence untouchable. A louder thud rocked the hull, jolting him upright. The scanners beeped, 3 small ships closing fast. Pirates. Maybe, or worse, he couldn't tell yet. Rick cursed, strapping Max into a makeshift harness on the co-pilot seat. "Hold tight, kid. Looks like Mommy's friends found us," he said. Max's eyes glowed, a wrench spinning in the air beside him. Rick smirked despite himself, a flicker of grim amusement. "Yeah, you're a kid, all right," he said, shaking his head. The cockpit door slid open as Rick prepped the blaster. The Black Pearl's engines rumbled to life, ready for a fight. He didn't know who was out there, closing in fast. But Zara's warning burned in his ears. They're coming. Her image burned in his mind, those curves, that voice of promise. Whatever this was, it was bigger than him, bigger than Max. And it was about to get messy. He could feel it. The Black Pearl rattled through the void, engines groaning as Rick pushed the ship hard. He was trying to outrun the 3 blips on the scanner, relentless pursuers. Pirates, or something worse, were closing in, their jagged ships slicing through space. Max sat strapped in the co-pilot's seat, his tiny hands clutching a bottle tightly. His glowing blue eyes were wide but calm, unshaken by the chaos. Rick's knuckles whitened on the controls, sweat beading on his brow. Zara's hologram still burned in his mind, her voice, her warning echoing. That ghost of a touch slid down his chest, a memory that lingered. "They're coming," she'd said, and it haunted him now. He didn't know who they were, but they weren't here for a friendly chat. "Hold on, Kit," Rick muttered, banking the ship sharp to evade. Max giggled, the bottle floating free for a second in the air. Rick snatched it back, shoving it into the harness with a scowl. "Not now, Max. We're in deep," he warned, focus razor sharp. The scanners beeped louder, 2 clicks and closing fast. He flipped the comms on, static crackling through the cockpit. "This is Black Pearl. Back off, or I'll make this rust bucket your problem." No response came, just the hiss of empty air mocking him. A thud slammed the hull, harder this time, jolting the ship. Rick cursed, checking the rear cams, a docking clamp locked onto the bay. "Great boarders," he growled, frustration boiling over. He unstrapped, grabbing his blaster with a swift motion. Hoisted Max under one arm, the kid's glow pulsing warm against his side. There was no time to think about it, no room for hesitation. He bolted for the cargo bay, boots pounding the metal deck. His heart raced, not just from the fight, but from her, Zara. She dropped this mess on him, a shadow he couldn't shake. The bay doors hissed, steam curling up as they split open. Rick ducked behind a crate, Max tucked close against him. He aimed his blaster, steadying his breath for what came next. 3 figures stepped through, armored, clawed, Zanari raiders with cold fire in their eyes. They weren't human, not fully. Tendrils of metal and flesh twisted along their arms. Weapons gleamed in their hands, sharp and menacing. "Where's the child?" One hissed, voice of grating rasp that chilled the air. Rick's grip tightened on the blaster. They wanted Max, no doubt. Before he could fire, a new sound cut through a low, fierce hum. It was like a blade slicing the air, sudden and sharp. The raiders turned, and she was there, Zara, in the flesh. No hologram this time. She was real, solid, and breathtaking. She stormed in from a side hatch, Zanari armor glinting under dim lights. Her armor hugged her like a second skin, tight over flexing thighs. It curved around hips that rolled with lethal grace, a sight to behold. The chest stretched full, pulling Rick's gaze despite the danger. Her dark tendrils flowed behind her, swaying like they were alive. They framed a face sharp with purpose, blue eyes blazing fiercely. Her lips set in a hard line, yet they still begged to be kissed. She moved fast, a blur of silver and fury in the bay. Her plasma blade slashed the first raider's arm clean off, sparks flying. The second lunged, claws swiping, but she ducked, spinning low. Her thigh brushed the floor as she drove the blade up through its chest. The third fired, a bolt sizzling past her, missing by inches. She rolled, tendrils whipping the air, landing in a crouch. Her armor stretched tight, every curve a weapon, every move a tease. Rick stared, blaster forgotten, heat flooding his gut instantly. "Holy void," he breathed, caught in her storm of motion. "Rick," she snapped, her voice cutting through the haze, commanding. "Move," she ordered, low and sharp, pulling him back. He blinked, shaking it off, and fired at the last raider. The shot caught its shoulder, making it stumble forward. Zara finished it, her blade sinking deep, arm flexing as she yanked it free. Blood spattered her armor, a dark streak sliding down her thigh. She straightened, chest heaving, tendrils settling around her. She turned to him, eyes locking his, the air thickening between them. It was a charge that wasn't just from the fight, something more. "You're late," Rick said, standing with Max still under his arm. His voice was rough, half from adrenaline, half from her presence. She stood there, all power and heat, like a dream made real. Zara stepped closer, her boots clicking on the metal floor. Her hips swayed just enough to pull his gaze downward. "I'm here now," she said, tone smooth with an edge that sparked his pulse. She stopped inches away, her scent hitting him, spice and steel. It was sharp and intoxicating, flooding his senses fully. Her eyes flicked to Max, softening for a heartbeat, then back to Rick. They hardened, deepened, holding him in place. "You kept him safe," she said, her voice carrying quiet approval. "Barely," Rick shot back, shifting Max higher in his grip. "He's yours, huh?" "Ours?" he asked, the question heavy in the air. Her lips parted, a breath slipping out, brushing his face. Warm, close. It was a tease he felt down his spine, electric and real. "Yes," she said, simple but loaded with unspoken weight. Her hand reached for Max, fingers brushing Rick's arm as she took him. It was a slow slide, her touch lingering, sending a jolt through him. She cradled Max, armor pressing against her chest tightly. Tendrils curled around the kid like a protective shield. "His name's Carr, Zanari 4 Unifier," she explained softly. "Max works too," Rick said, smirking despite the tension. "Suits the little troublemaker," he added, lighter now. Zara's lips twitched, a hint of a smile, rare and dangerous. Rick's gut tightened, her closeness too real, too vivid. Every memory of Lithos. 9 roared back, her hands, her heat, that night. The ship jolted again, alarms blaring through the cockpit. "More incoming," Zara said, handing Max back to Rick. Her fingers grazed his chest, a deliberate brush, stopping his breath. "We need to move." "Now," she urged, turning swiftly. She headed for the cockpit, hips rolling with every step. Her armor glinted like a promise he couldn't ignore. Rick followed, Max tucked close, eyes trailing her, those thighs that sway. In the cockpit, she slid into the co-pilot's seat like it was hers. Her legs crossed, thigh brushing his as she leaned over the controls. "They're Zanari renegades," she said, fingers flying across the console. "They want Carr, his power," she continued, tendrils swaying gently. "I hit him with you to keep him off their scanners," she revealed. "Nice plan," Rick grunted, punching the throttle hard. "Except the part where I'm dodging claws and you're a ghost for weeks." Her shoulder pressed his as the ship lurched, warm and firm. "I had a war to fight," she said, voice low, steady. Her breath grazed his ear as she adjusted a dial carefully. "I trusted you, Rick, more than you know," she admitted. Her hand slipped, brushing his arm, a slow, hot slide lingering. He swallowed hard, the cockpit shrinking around their tension. "Trust, huh?" he said, voice rougher with every word. "You got a funny way of showing it," he shot back. He banked the ship, dodging a plasma bolt narrowly. Her thigh pressed tighter against his, strong, warm, burning through his suit. She smirked, just a flicker, knowing her effect on him. Rick cursed under his breath. She always had that power. The scanners beeped. 2 ships left, gaining fast. Zara leaned closer, her chest brushing his shoulder as she tapped the screen. Her scent flooded him, spice and steel overwhelming. "Here," she said, pointing to the Proximus relay station ahead. "We can lose them there," she added, tendrils grazing his neck. They were soft and electric, sending heat pooling low. "Fine," he said, voice tight, gripping the controls harder. "But you're explaining this, all of this, when we're clear," he demanded. He shot her a look, catching her eyes, blue, deep, a challenge. She held it, lips parting, the air crackling between them. "Deal," she murmured, her hand resting on his arm briefly. It was a firm, warm grip that slid to his wrist before pulling back. "Keep us alive, cargo man," she teased, echoing Lithos 9. Rick's pulse hammered. She was trouble, flesh and fire now. The station loomed ahead, a jagged speck growing fast. Rick pushed the engines harder, Zara beside him. Her heat, her presence. Max giggled, a bottle floating free, breaking the intensity. Rick caught it, shoving it back with a grin at the kid. "You're her kid." "All right," he said, stealing a glance at Zara. She smirked, tendrils swaying, a storm he couldn't outrun. For a moment, the void didn't feel so cold, not with her burning next to him. The Black Pearl streaked toward the Proximus relay station, a jagged silhouette against the void. Its flickering lights offered a faint promise of safety in the dark expanse. Rick's hands gripped the controls, knuckles white as he pushed the engines past their limit. The engines screamed under the strain, a desperate roar filling the cockpit. Zara sat beside him, her thigh pressed tight against his in the cramped space. It was a firm, warm line that sent heat curling through him despite the chaos. "Max, car," she'd called him, hovered in his harness, giggling softly. A bottle spun lazily in the air, caught in his playful glow. His blue light pulsed like a heartbeat, steady amid the storm. The scanners blared. 2 Zenari renegade ships were fast and closing in. Their plasma bolts grazed the hull with sizzling, angry thuds. "Hold on," Rick growled, banking the ship hard to evade the fire. Zara's shoulder slammed into his, her armor clinking against him. Her tendrils brushed his neck, soft, electric, a tease he couldn't ignore. She leaned over the console, her chest grazing his arm as she tapped the screen. Her scent, spice, and steel flooded the tight space, overwhelming his senses. "They're locking weapons," she said, voice low and sharp with urgency. Her breath was hot against his ear, sending a shiver through him. "We got minutes," she added, her tone a quiet command. "Great," Rick muttered, dodging another bolt with a sharp twist. "Any bright ideas, warrior lady?" he asked, half sarcastic, half hopeful. Her hand slid to his wrist, a quick, firm grip burning through his sleeve. She smirked, just a flicker, her blue eyes glinting with confidence. "Get us inside the station," she said, pulling back slowly. Her fingers lingered a second too long, sparking heat in his veins. "I'll handle the rest," she promised, unstrapping with fluid grace. Her tendrils swayed as she stood, hips rolling in a deliberate stretch. Her armor tightened, thighs flexing, curves catching the dim light. Rick's jaw clenched, heat pooling low in his gut instantly. He nodded, shoving the throttle forward with renewed focus. The station loomed closer, its docking bay a narrow, gaping maw. A bolt clipped the wing, rocking the ship violently. Zara braced herself, her hand grabbing Rick's shoulder, nails digging in. It was a jolt that made him curse under his breath, sharp and sudden. "Easy, Shiny," he said, smirking despite the sweat on his brow. "I've got this," he assured her, fighting to keep control. She shot him a look, half warning, half something deeper, unspoken. Her grip tightened, sliding slowly down his arm, leaving him breathless. The Black Pearl scraped through the bay doors, metal shrieking loudly. The ship shuddered to a stop, jolting them in their seats. Rick unstrapped, grabbing his blaster with a swift motion. Zara scooped Max from the harness, tendrils wrapping him like a shield. "Stay close," she said, her voice a husky command hitting Rick low. He nodded, following her out, eyes flicking to her hips inevitably. They swayed with every step, a rhythm he couldn't shake off. The station was a maze of rusted corridors and flickering lights. The air hung thick with oil and dust, heavy and stale. They moved fast, Zara leading with her armor glinting in the shadows. Rick kept pace, Max under his arm, the kids' glow lighting their path. A clang echoed behind them. Boots on metal, too many to count. "They're here," Zara whispered, pulling Rick into a side passage. Her hand gripped his chest, a firm, warm press stopping his breath. She pushed him against the wall, her body close, thighs brushing his. Her chest grazed his shirt as she peeked out, tendrils swaying gently. "Too many," she murmured, lips near his ear, breath warm and teasing. "We need a trap," she decided, her voice low with intent. Her hand slid from his chest to his waist, adjusting his stance slowly. Fingers traced his hip, a deliberate burn making his pulse race. Rick swallowed, the tight space shrinking around their closeness. Her heat was a fire he couldn't dodge, consuming him. "Got a plan?" he asked, voice rough, fighting past her touch. She nodded, pulling a small orb from her belt, blue and humming softly. It was like the one from her hologram, a familiar pulse. "Disruptor," she said, handing it to him, fingers brushing his own. The lingering slide sparked down his spine, electric and sharp. "Set it there," she instructed, pointing to a junction ahead. Her arms stretched, armor pulling tight over her chest visibly. Rick moved, crouching low, Max tucked close against him. He rigged the orb, its hum growing sharper with each second. Glance back, Zara watched, her pose lethal and hot, thighs braced. Tendrils framed her like a crown, a vision in the dark. "Done," he said, retreating to her side quickly. She grabbed his arm, pulling him into a nook, a tight fit. Her body pressed as against the wall, chest pushing into his. Thighs pinned his legs, her breath hitting his neck, hot, quick. It was a tease that made his hands itch to grab her. "Quiet," she whispered, lips brushing his ear, sending a shiver through him. Her tendrils curled around his shoulder, soft and warm against his skin. Rick bit back a groan, the tension thick enough to choke on. Footsteps clattered closer, 5 Zenari raiders, claws glinting menacingly. The orb pulsed, then erupted, blue light ripping through the air. It fried their sensors, sending them stumbling into walls. Zara moved, fast, fierce, a silver storm unleashed. She lunged, plasma blade slashing, her body twisting gracefully. Thighs flexed, hips rolled, armor hugging every curve as she struck. She took one down, her motion a deadly dance. Rick fired, the shot blasting another's chest with precision. A third swiped at him, claws grazing his arm painfully. He ducked, rolling, and Zara was there, blade sinking into the raider. Her arm brushed his back, a quick, hot contact that burned. "Stay sharp," she snapped, eyes flicking to his with a spark of heat. "Two left." Rick grabbed a coolant canister, spraying it across the floor. Globs floated in the low gravity, slick and treacherous. The raiders slipped, flailing as they lost their footing. Zara smirked, tossing her blade to Rick with a flick. "Catch," she said, her hand brushing his, a sudden jolt. He grabbed it, slashing a raider's leg with a swift cut. She tackled the last, pinning it with her thighs locking its arms. Her chest heaved as she drove her fist into its face hard. Blood streaked her armor, sliding down her thigh in a dark line. She stood, breathing hard, tendrils wild around her. Rick handed the blade back, their fingers tangling in a slow, warm slide. It stopped his breath, the contact lingering between them. "Nice moves," he said, voice low, eyes tracing her form. Sweat gleamed on her silver skin, armor clinging tighter now. She stepped closer, her hip brushing his, a deliberate tease. "You're not bad yourself," she murmured, voice husky and inviting. Her lips parted as she looked him over, eyes lingering on his chest. The air crackled, her tendrils grazing his neck once more. Rick's hand twitched, wanted to pull her in, to feel her heat. Max giggled, a wrench floating past, breaking the charged moment. Zara laughed, a low, sultry sound that hit him hard. She took Max from him, her hand sliding from his arm to his chest. It was a firm, lingering press that stirred him deeply. "We're not clear yet," she said, stepping back with purpose. Her hips swayed as she moved, a rhythm pulling him along. "They'll send more," she warned, her tone steady but edged. Rick followed, blaster ready, eyes locked on her, those thighs that glow. They reached a sealed hatch, Zara slicing it open with her blade. Sparks flew as the metal parted under her strike. Inside was a control room, screens flickering, air stale and heavy. She set Max on a console, his glow lighting the dark space. Turned to Rick, her stance wide, armor stretching over strong thighs. Hips cocked, chest rising with a breath, she faced him. "We need to fry their ships," she said, leaning close to him. Her shoulder brushed his, a warm, steady heat radiating. "Rig the station's core," she instructed, voice firm and clear. "Boom time, huh?" Rick said, smirking, though his voice was rough. Her nearness was a distraction, pulling at his focus. She nodded, her hand resting on his arm, a grip sliding to his elbow. It teased, pulling him to a panel with subtle intent. "Here," she said, her thigh pressing his as they worked together. Fingers brushed, breaths mingled, tension thick between them. He yanked wires, her hands guiding his in a slow dance. Her touch burned through his sleeve, igniting his nerves. "You're too close," he muttered, half joking, half desperate. Her chest grazed his back, tendrils tickling his neck softly. "Deal with it," she shot back, voice a purr near his ear. The core hummed, power surging as she smirked, pulling back. Her hand slid from his arm to his hip, stopping just short of trouble. "Set. Let's go," she said, motion decisive and swift. They grabbed Max, sprinting for the bay as the station trembled. The core overloaded, lights flaring in a chaotic burst. The Raiders' ships sparked outside, caught in the blast's fury. They shattered into dust, debris scattering across the void. The Black Pearl roared free, shaking but alive through it all. Rick slumped into the pilot's seat, Zara beside him once more. Her thigh pressed his again, her glow a steady fire beside him. "You're insane," he said, catching his breath, eyes on her. Sweat shone on her skin, armor streaked, tendrils wild and fierce. She leaned closer, her hand brushing his chest, a warm, deliberate tease. "You love it," she murmured, voice low, eyes locking his own. It was a challenge, a promise sparking between them. Rick's pulse raced, the void stretching ahead endlessly. With her next to him, heat and danger. The Black Pearl drifted free of the Proximus relay station's wreckage, its engines humming steady now. The void stretched wide and quiet around them. Rick slumped in the pilot's chair, adrenaline fading from his body. His shirt was damp with sweat, a fresh scratch stinging his arm. The Zenari renegades were gone, their ships reduced to glowing dust scattered across the stars. Beside him, Zara leaned against the console, her armor streaked with blood and grime. Her tendrils drooped, but her blue eyes remained sharp and alive. Max, Carr, sat strapped in the co-pilot's seat, his tiny glow pulsing soft and calm. A bottle hovered lazily in his grip as he giggled. They'd made it. Against all odds, they'd survived. Rick exhaled, running a hand through his messy hair. "Well, that was a hell of a day," he said, his voice rough but lighter now. He glanced at Zara, her silver skin glinting under the cockpit lights. Her armor hugged her thighs and hips, her chest rising with slow breaths. She caught his look, her lips curving into a small, dangerous smile. It hit him low, stirring something restless inside. "You're welcome," she said, her tone husky and teasing. She crossed her arms, the move pulling her armor tighter across her chest. Rick's pulse kicked up, his eyes tracing her, sweat gleaming on her neck. Tendrils framed her like a dark halo, hotter than ever in the mess of battle. "Yeah, thanks for not getting us killed," he shot back, smirking. "And for dropping a kid on me with no manual," he added, nodding Max. Max giggled, the bottle drifting higher in the air. Zara laughed, a low, sultry sound that curled around him. She stepped closer, her hip brushing his chair deliberately. It was a tease that made his gut tighten with heat. "He's worth it," she murmured, leaning down to Max. Her tendrils brushed Rick's arm as she adjusted the harness, a soft, warm graze. It sent a shiver through him, electric and undeniable. She straightened, her thigh pressing his knee for a heartbeat. Her eyes met his, blue depths sparking with more than victory. "Don't get soft on me now, Zara," he said, voice low. His smirk faltered as she stepped closer still, boots clicking softly. Her scent, spice and steel, flooded him, sharp and intoxicating. Her hand rested on his shoulder, fingers sliding slow to his chest. It was a firm, warm press that stopped his breath entirely. "Soft's not my style," she whispered, her lips near his ear. Her breath was hot and teasing, igniting his skin. "But I owe you, cargo man," she added, tendrils curling around his neck. It was a feather-light touch that burned deep inside him. Rick's hands clenched on the chair, fighting the urge to pull her closer. The ship jolted. A stutter in the engines broke the moment. Max giggled again, his glow flickering playfully. Zara pulled back, her hand lingering on his chest a second longer. She smirked, a knowing glint in her eyes. "Engines took a hit," she said, stepping to the console. Her hips swayed, a rhythm that kept Rick's gaze locked. "We need to patch it," she declared, voice steady but still sultry. Rick stood, shaking off the haze, and grabbed a toolkit. "Lead the way, Shiny," he said, following her lead. She shot him a look, half challenge, half promise, and headed for the engine bay. Max was tucked under her arm, her walk a slow burn he couldn't ignore. The bay was tight, pipes and panels crowding the space. Air hung thick with oil and heat around them. Zara set Max on a crate, his glow lighting the dim room. She bent over the engine hatch, armor stretching tight across her form. Her thighs flexed, hips cocked as she pried it open. Rick crouched beside her, tools in hand, but his eyes stuck. Sweat slid down her silver skin, pooling at the curve of her waist. It was a sight that made his throat dry with want. "Focus," she said, not looking up, her voice teasing and low. She knew exactly what she was doing to him. "Trying," he muttered, wrenching a bolt loose. She leaned closer, her shoulder brushing his, a steady, warm contact. Her hand guided his, fingers sliding over his knuckles slowly. It was a hot tease that sparked down his arm. "You're not helping," he said, voice rough with distraction. Her thigh pressed his, firm and close in the cramped space. "Good," she murmured, her breath grazing his neck. Tendrils tickled his jaw, sending heat racing through him. She twisted a wire, her chest brushing his arm briefly. It was a soft press that made him curse under his breath. The engine hummed, sparking back to life with her touch. She pulled back, smirking, her hand resting on his hip. It was a deliberate grip that stopped just shy of trouble. "Fixed," she said, standing with a stretch that flaunted her curves. Rick stood, wiping sweat from his brow, eyes locked on her. Grime streaked her armor, tendrils wild, a warrior goddess in his junker ship. "You're dangerous," he said, stepping closer. The toolkit was forgotten on the floor. Her smirk widened, and she tilted her head slightly. Tendrils swayed, her glow a fire he couldn't resist. "You love it," she said, voice a purr as she closed the gap. Her chest brushed his, thighs grazing his legs with intent. Her hand slid from his hip to his waist, a slow, warm climb. It burned through his shirt, setting his nerves alight. Rick's breath hitched, his hand finding her arm. Her silver skin was firm under his fingers, a heat he'd craved since Lithos 9. "Yeah," he admitted, voice low, "I do." He pulled her in, her lips crashing into his, a fierce, hungry kiss. Her tendrils wrapped his shoulders, her body pressed tight against him. Thighs to his, chest to his, it was a fire that lit him up. Her hands roamed, fingers tracing his chest, sliding to his back. She gripped hard, and Rick groaned into her mouth. The taste of her, spice and steel, was a memory made real. She pulled back, breathless, eyes blazing with heat. Her smirk teased, promising more to come. Max giggled, a wrench floating past, breaking the spell. They laughed, the tension easing but not gone. Zara stepped back, her hand lingering on his chest, a warm, steady press. "Later," she whispered, her voice a sultry vow. Rick nodded, pulse racing, the void outside forgotten. The ship's screen flickered, a star map popping up, uncharted chords. "Old data," Zara said, leaning over the console, her hip brushing his. It was a final tease that kept him hooked. "A new start, maybe," she mused, voice soft but firm. Rick sat, pulling her beside him, her thigh pressed his a steady heat. He punched the chords in, the ship humming with purpose. "Wherever we're going," he said, smirking, "you're cooking." "I've seen Max try disaster," he added, glancing at the kid. She laughed, tendrils swaying, and leaned closer. Her shoulder was warm against his, her glow a light in the dark. "I'm terrible," she admitted, her voice low, lips near his ear. "But I'm good at keeping you warm," she teased, hands sliding to his knee. It was a firm, teasing grip that promised more nights like Litho's 9. "Prove it, shiny," he said, pushing the throttle forward. The black pearls surged ahead, stars stretching before them. Max giggled, his bottle floating in the air. Rick glanced at Zara, silver skin, blue eyes, a fire he'd never outrun. The void was vast, but with her, her heat, her fight, it felt like home. Rick thought back. Months alone, hauling junk, drowning in quiet. Then Max, a spark that changed it all. And Zara, a flame that burned through his walls. Litho's 9 had been a night, a clash. But this was more. Messy, real, a bond forged in blood and heat. He wasn't just surviving anymore. With her, with Max, he was alive. The stars winked, endless and indifferent. "What's out there?" Zara asked, her voice soft, tendrils brushing his arm. "No clue," he said, grinning wide. "Let's find out," he added, the ship humming on. A battered trio, Rick, Zara, Max, chasing a horizon they'd build together. One wild, heated step at a time.